Hello there, my name is Michael Maynard and welcome back to Gorilla Picking. Now, what are we going to do today, folks? Well, we're going to do a deep dive on a very interesting lock indeed. This is a thing called a Medeco Duracam. That's what the lock looks like when it's in one piece. That's what the key looks like. And what we're going to do is talk an awful lot about how this lock was designed, what it's designed to do, and funnily enough, how to pick it. So we're going to be as exhaustive as we possibly can. So I think this actually might be a bit of a long video, folks, but you know, we'll get there. All right, so for a start, let's have a think about what this lock is and what it was designed to do. Well, it was designed for the casino industry. So in that regard, it's actually very similar to the Disassemble, which is a lock that shares a lot of this lock's DNA. They're both designed to be moderately secure. This isn't a high security lock, okay, but they're designed to be moderately secure, very robust, very cheap, very hard to break, and very resistant of wear. So this is a lock that is designed to be used over and over and over and over again in a high traffic environment by people who might not have a lot of training. So you think about the guy that empties the money out of the casino machines in Las Vegas, you know. That guy hasn't had a course on how to look after locks. He's had a course on how to stick a key in a hole, get the money out of the gadget and lock it all back up again, you know. And so he's going to be a bit slapdash. It's going to be a difficult environment. And so these locks are made with very, very big, thick, strong keys. So you look at the size of that, right? Very similar to the Disassemble key, in fact. So again, a ridiculously strong, hard to break key. Very difficult to duplicate key, so this cannot be cut by your local locksmith. It has to be duplicated by the Medeco factory itself. So very secure, very difficult for you know, just some random punter to get one of these things cut. And very tolerant of wear. Now, I'd actually just like to talk about that for a minute because that's a very important thing. Let's say this thing's getting locked and unlocked a dozen times a day. I don't know how many times, but you know, it's going to get used a lot. And that means there's going to be a lot of wear. So the way that the Disassemble solves this problem is that, in fact, the sliders in here, there's a sidebar on each side and there are 4 or 5 sliders, right? Those sliders have got no springs in them whatsoever. So when you put that key in that keyway, there is no resistance whatsoever. The key just slides in real easy. Now, these little pins here, okay, take a step back. We're using the driverless Medeco biaxial system. So that means there's no driver pins, okay? So you've just got one little key pin that effectively does the job of the driver as well, but the little springs here that drive those pins are very, very weak. They're just pathetic little things, okay? And so that means that they're not pushing those pins down real hard, which in turn means that the key slides in relatively easily. It's not as frictionless as a lock with no springs, but it's, you know, it's pretty close. So, I guess that actually means that we should probably start talking about how this lock actually works. So, it is an evolution of the standard Medeco biaxial, the driverless biaxial, and that pinning system has been around since the 1970s. So, the earliest patent I could find was 1971, and these pins, these chisel tip pins, are in fact exactly the same as the ones that you will find in a, let's say, 5-pin conventionally keyed biaxial padlock. So my point here is that Medeco have made a bazillion of these pins. They already had these pins existing, right? So they didn't have to design a whole new pinning system. All they needed to do was work out a way to make them function as a dimple lock instead of a standard pin tumbler lock. So in all other respects, they work exactly the same. You've got to raise them to a specific height. you've got to rotate them to a specific angle, and then once you've done that, you have got, we'll see the details of the pin in a minute, but you've got little holes that the sidebar fingers have to slot into, and then the lock will open. So very well understood. They had all these parts, they had all the stuff sitting around. All they really had to do was make the housings, and that comes in a 4 and a 5 pin version, and make the cores, which again are basically the same thing, just one's a shorter version of the other, and design a new key, and off they went. So very, very simple. Why is it important that it's simple? Well, again, you want it cheap, right? And you want it reliable, and generally the simpler something is mechanically, the more cheap and the more reliable it's going to be, because you're probably going to need to change these quite frequently. So one of the security features that most casinos have is that they would in fact change the locks on a reasonably frequent schedule, right? So it might be once a year or whatever. Or let's say a disgruntled employee leaves and takes the master key with them, right? They want to be able to replace these things quick and easy, and so they can just do that at minimal expense. All right, so what have we said? We've said that these are biaxial driverless pins. They've been around for 40, 50 years. We all know how they work, but I think I should maybe show you the pins in some detail, because this is where it starts to get interesting from a lock picking perspective. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a bit of a close-up of a pin for a start, and then we're going to go to a diagram, a couple of drawings that I've made. So what you can see here is that it is a very simple, very small pin. It's got the chisel tip. It has got 2 grooves. Those 2 grooves are vitally important, folks. Okay, remember those. It has got a wing on one side. Let's just rotate around so we can see that. And the whole idea of that wing is simply so that it locates the pin in the right place in the chamber. And why don't we show you that? Because it's very simple to do. Here's our chamber. You can see that the sidebar is on this side and it's got its fingers pointing in. Here's our pin, and we've got a little cutout here, a little notch, so that that pin can rotate over that sort of range and no further. That's what that little wing does. And then on the other side of the pin, of course, we've got the true gate for the sidebar. So let's just roll that round. There's our little hole for the sidebar, and you can see that that coincides with one of the grooves. Now that is really, really important, and again we're going to come to that in a minute. So just while we're on the subject of these pins, I'd like to talk about the key space, and the key space on this lock is absolutely phenomenally large. This lock bats so far above its weight you wouldn't believe it. Okay, so as far as we're aware, there are 4 different bitting heights that this pin can go to. So think of that as being 4 steps on a standard key. Okay, so we've got 4 heights, and we know that each pin has to be at one of 3 rotations. It can be backwards, neutral, or forwards. So we've got 4 times 3 is 12 possible bitting steps, okay? But it actually goes a step beyond that, because we can either orient the chisel tip towards the front of the lock or towards the back, and that's a whole different bitting as well. So if you have a quick look at this key here, you will see that in the middle here we don't have a regular step between these cuts. So the first couple of cuts are about as far as you might expect them to be, and then this one's real close to the front one, and then there's a big gap, and then there's another 2 there. So the reason for that is that this pin in the middle here, pin 3, has actually got its chisel tip one way, as opposed to all these others which have got it going the other way. So the Medeco term for that is to have the chisel tip fore or aft. So what we've got now is 4 different heights times 3 different orientations, that's 12, times 2 different chisel directions, that's fore and aft, that's 24. And we got 5 of those, right? So we've got 24 times 24 times 24 times 24 times 24 equals 7.9 million, if you can believe that, different bitting steps. And that's even before you start talking about keyway shapes. So this key here fits my 5-pin lock. It absolutely does not fit my 4-pin lock, so there's obviously a different keyway shape here. The key space, the potential number of keyways and key spaces that you can have with this locking system is absolutely huge. And again, it punches way above its weight. You look at this thing, and you think, 4 or 5 little pins, you can't really get much out of that, but you can get an enormous amount of key differs. You really can. Thank you to D&D, Do Not Duplicate, and Mick Emhert on the Australasian Pickers Discord forum. They were the guys that told me about the 4 different heights. I didn't know how many heights there were, so those guys confirmed that. Okay, all right. Now, I told you I was going to show you some pictures, and I think we should probably do that. So just let me grab my pictures here from my notes, and let's start talking about these pins in detail. So first of all, here's our pin from the top. We've got this little locating lug at the top here that the spring goes over the top of. We've got the pin itself, and then there's that wing on one side that I was telling you about that simply stops it over rotating in the chamber. That's pretty self-explanatory. Now let's have a look at the pin from the wing side. So now we're looking in from this side. Not much to see here, guys. We've just got the chisel tip, and we've got the wing going down the length of the pin, and that's about it. But all the magic happens on the other side. Okay, this is where the proverbial rubber meets the proverbial road. So again, I'm going to show you this pin so that you've got something to kind of hold in your head. All right, there's our pin. There's our 2 grooves, 1, 2, okay. And the true gate, that little hole there that the finger of the sidebar is going to poke into, is across either one, but not both, of these little notches. So, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that you've got one true gate here, and then when the notch, when the pin of the sidebar is anywhere on this groove, or anywhere on this groove other than at the hole here, you're actually in what is effectively a false gate. That is a crucial bit of information that you are going to need to know later on. So again, I emphasize, we've got 2 grooves. Across one of those grooves, we've got a hole which is the true gate for the finger pin of the sidebar to go into, and the rest of these grooves function as a false gate. Please remember that, folks, because that is the absolute key to getting into this lock. Righto, folks, well, we are well and truly into part 2 of this video. We're starting to talk about how to pick this thing. So, what is it? Again, you know what it is by now. It's a dimple lock version of a Medeco biaxial. So that means you've got to raise the pins to a certain height and get the pins to a certain orientation. You've got to make sure that you don't hit the false gates, and then once you've done that, you're going to get the lock open. Right, well, how are we going to do that? So the first thing you've got to do here is decide whether you're going to pick this clockwise or anti-clockwise. Now, these locks come with a little, I don't know what you call it really, a little detent maybe, that you can put on the back of the lock to tell the lock which way it wants to open. I find that this lock is much easier to open anti-clockwise. And if you guys have picked dimple locks before, you will know why that is. So this will be familiar to everybody that's picked a dimple lock, okay? But you want the direction that your flag is turning to be opposite to the direction that your tension tool is going, to make it easier to set pins that need counter rotation. Let me say that again because this is very important, folks. If you are turning everything clockwise, let's say you are tensioning this clockwise and you are trying to pick clockwise, it makes it very hard to counter rotate out of these little grooves. On the other hand, if you are tensioning anti-clockwise and picking in the opposite direction to that, if you're tensioning one way and picking the other, you will find it far easier to get out of those grooves. Now, we can choose to do this either way, folks. We're not doing this in the dead of night for real. We're doing this on our desk at home because we're hobbyists. And for me personally, I like to do that the easiest way I can. So I have set up the lock to go anti-clockwise. Next thing, I know that some people pick dimple locks with all kinds of weird and wonderful tools. I don't. I pick dimple locks with a dimple flag. Full stop, end of story. That's just how it is. And by far my favourite pick is the Spooks tool dimple. I've been using this for years and years and years, and I know exactly how it feels. You pick down the short side, so you're coming in from that direction, which lets you feel what those pins are doing, and it also means that you've got something to rest your pick up against on that other side. Now, that will do for the vertical dimension of these pins. Now, some folks will also use the same tool, the same flag, to set the rotational aspect of the pins as well. I personally find that with a lot of Medeco locks, I'm actually better using two different tools. I use one tool to do the vertical dimension and I use a different tool to do the rotation, and this lock is definitely one of those ones. So how do I do it? I use the flag for the vertical, and for the rotation I'm actually using, I don't even know what it's called, a V31. It's one of the very, very good multi-pick short hooks, and what that lets me do is get underneath those pins and rotate them from the rear. So I need to explain that to you, folks. Here's our chisel tipped pin. I'm getting underneath it with the flag to raise it upwards, and then I am going behind it in order to rotate it left and right with a hook. Now again, I completely agree, there will be some folks who just use one tool to do both things. In my hands, this works better and I have much more control. Now, speaking of control, we also need to talk about tension. Like every other medium to high security lock, it begins and ends with the tension, folks. Okay, you've just got to get the tension tool right. You want the thickest, strongest one that you can wedge in there, and I actually don't know how thick this is. Just give me a sec, guys. We'll just measure. Okay, so that's a 1.26 millimeter thick tension tool. Whatever, doesn't matter. Needs to be good and thick though, because what you need to be able to do here is wedge it in there without it graunching onto the side of the lock. So it needs to be just touching the plug. You need to be able to put quite heavy tension on there. You need to be able to back that right off so that you've got light tension on there so that you can manipulate the rotational aspect of the pins, and you need to actually counter rotate so that you can get pins in and out of those little grooves. You want absolutely the thickest, strongest tension tool in there that you possibly can. So you now understand why I'm going anti-clockwise. It's so that I can get my pick down the side here, pick clockwise, and get in and out of the grooves much more easily. You now know that I am using two different tools, one for the vertical and one for the rotational, and that is just straight out personal preference on my part. You could possibly use the same flag for both. I don't, because I've got better feel with this. And then the next thing we need to do is talk about how the lock is actually going to pick. Now for this, honest to God, it's simple, guys. It is not difficult at all. Once you have learned how these things look, and you now know that, right, there's two grooves, and one of those grooves has got a true gate on it, you now know how this thing's going to operate. So the first part of the picking, you put medium tension on the lock, and you gently nudge the binders up. You're not dealing with the rotational aspect at this stage. You don't care, right? They pick at this stage very much like tapered pins with lots of little tiny clicks. So you'll spend a few minutes just nudging those pins slowly higher, and then what's going to happen is that you are going to get a little tiny falset. You're going to get a little tiny click. Now, what just happened when you hit that little tiny click is crucial. What you just did was got all 5 of those finger pins into the first of the grooves of the pins. So each pin is now lifted to its first groove. Each finger pin has snicked into that groove, and that's where your little turn came from. Now, have a think about this, folks. One of a couple of things could be happening here. Either you fluked it on a given pin, and the sidebar finger pin went straight into the little hole first time, in which case that pin is set, it's done, you're not going to touch it again. That happens about half the time, I reckon. So it's these locks pick differently every time, right? But about half the time, you'll fluke it and it'll just snick straight in. And you're going to find, to figure that out, you're going to use what a lot of people these days call the tap test. But you're just looking for a pin that isn't rock solid. So if you put your pick in there, let's say we're dealing with pin 1, and we've clicked into the falset so that we know all 5 of those finger pins must be in the first groove in each pin somewhere, okay? And you give that pin a little twiddle and there's a little tiny bit of movement in there, that tells you that you've got that sidebar finger set in its true gate. You're done. On the other hand, let's say you give it a bit of a poke and it's absolutely rock solid. Right, what does that tell you? That tells you that either, where's my picture? Either you are in the right groove, but you're just to one side of the hole a little bit, or the hole's actually up here and there's no true gate on this one at all. So what you're going to do, you're going to get in there with your little turning tool now, your little wiggling tool, and you are going to rotate that pin backwards and forwards a little bit. So you back the tension right off and you give it a bit of a wiggle. So what's happening now is that the pin is sliding backwards and forwards along this groove, right? And if you've got a true gate in there somewhere, then it's going to snick into that true gate and the pin is going to go a bit loose on you. Great, happy days. You're done with that one. You can move on to the next one, all right? So you go through all 5 pins, You figure out if they're in a true gate. If they are, you leave them alone. If they're not, you get your wiggling tool in there and you back the tension off and you wiggle them backwards and forwards. And if it goes into a true gate at that point, again, happy days, you're done, right? But if after having gone through all 5 pins, you've given them a wiggle and number 1, the lock still isn't open, right? And number 2, there are some pins that are still absolutely rock solid, that tells you that there was no true gate on that groove, and you've got to go up the next one. You've got to lift that particular pin 1 step higher. This isn't difficult, guys. It's just a matter of logic, you know. So let's say you went through that system and you found that pin 2, you wiggled it backwards and forwards. You're absolutely sure you rotated that pin quite a lot. It didn't fall into a true gate at any point. At that stage, you know for an absolute fact that there's no true gate on that groove. So, hey, we've got to lift number 2 that little bit further. So what do? You back off on the tension even further. So now we're at the point where we're counter-rotating. We lift it up a tiny bit and click into the next groove up. Now, you don't need to lift it far, folks. How far are those little grooves from each other? Maybe a mil at the most. You lift that up. It clicks into the next groove. You go through and you set whatever else you dropped in doing that, because you had to counter rotate it, and it's like counter rotating any spool or any serrated pin. You're going to drop something on the way through. So you set everything back up again, and then you test again. And if you have got all your ducks in a row, you're now onto a groove that does have a true gate, and you find the one that's binding. Let's say it's pin 2, and you get in there with your twiddling tool and you twiddle it backwards and forwards, and it drops into that final hole, and there's your lock open. It isn't difficult, folks. So I want to recap that, and then we're going to pick it, and then we're done. How do we pick it? Decent tension. A tool to lift the pins, a tool to rotate the pins. Could be the same tool. Your call on that. I don't care. First stage is to gently lift everything up until each pin drops into its first groove. That's like picking a tapered pin. You'll cycle through maybe a dozen times. You'll finally get that click, and you're in that first groove. You then check for binders. If you've got a binder, you get in there with your wiggling tool and you wiggle that pin backwards and forwards to rotate it. If that sets the pin, great. If it doesn't, you know that you need to lift that pin up 1 click. So you get back to your lifting tool again, flag in my case. You counter rotate that pin up. You get it to the next groove up. You check to see if that's in the false gate or true gate, and if it's in the false one, you move it around a bit, and then once you've done that a couple of times, that lock is open. Hope that made sense, folks. Let's do a worked example. All right, folks, well, here's the moment of truth. Am I any good or am I full of shit? So here is our lock. I've got it set up to go anti-clockwise. We remove the key, and you must rake the pins. So sometimes these pins will give you a bit of a sweetheart deal, and it'll be an easy pick. You need to rake them to prove that they're randomised. Okay, tension tool in. We're going to go anti-clockwise. You know about that now. Let's get in there and let's see what's binding. One or two little bits and pieces. One's binding like crazy. Getting little tiny clicks all the time here. One gone back to binding again. Got a little click out of it. Keep going. Nothing really happening here, just getting tiny clicks the whole time. One pin feels really solid already. Two was binding like crazy, four's not going anywhere. Click on three. Lots of things are binding a bit tighter. That would suggest to me that we're getting closer to this false set. There we go, we just dropped into it. I don't know if you guys could see that, but there wasn't much to see or feel, just got a little tiny click. Okay, so let's go through. One, not binding. Two, not binding. Three, binding like a madman. Four, still actually getting some clicks here. I think we're not quite in the groove, or something's not. Not one, not two, not three, not four, five. There's our bigger click. Okay, right. Now I'm happy that we're in the groove. One and two feel good. Four is absolutely rock solid. Five feels good. Okay, so let's give, that's one, that's two, that's three, that's four. Backed off on the tension now and giving four a good wiggle. One feels fine, two feels fine. They both feel like they're in true gates. Three's rock solid. Four's rock solid still. Interesting. Five feels good. Okay, so we know at the very least we've got to nudge four up one groove. And I think three was the other binder here, so I've just eased right back. Okay. Did we get any joy out of that? Let's see. One, two, three, still rock solid. Okay, I'm going to counter rotate three up. Just dropping back on the tension. Okay, just raise three. Don't seem to have dropped a lot else, which is good. One feels good, two feels good. Three has dropped, I think. Four needs to be raised. Let's counter rotate that. I think I got that. Let's find out. What did we drop? Not one, not two. Three feels good. Four's binding like crazy. Okay. That's five. So that's four. Okay. freeze dropped, and we're open, just like that. So you saw what I did, folks. I just absolutely followed that heuristic. So got them to the first false set effectively, checked for the ones that were set there, found the ones that weren't, wiggled them to see if there was a true gate on that groove. If there wasn't, lifted it up further, checked for the false gate there, and once we did that, we're open. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. What I'd like you to do, if I have missed anything out, or if you've got something to add, then I'd really like you to add your comments below, folks. There's our 5 pins, just to prove that we got them. I really want to make this video the definitive reference on this lock. So if there's something that I've forgotten, something that you want to add, please, please, please put a comment down below. And what we'll do is we'll add your comments to the general pool of knowledge to what I hope is going to be the definitive guide to the Duracam. Thanks for watching, folks. My name's Michael Maynard. This is Gorilla Picking, and that was the Duracam.